Leyte, the Philippines. October 1944. American forces pushing inland from the beaches found something they had not expected. Villages already liberated. Japanese patrols already eliminated. A woman in a plain black dress, barefoot, standing in a jungle clearing surrounded by over 100 armed men, waiting to shake hands with the officers she had been fighting toward for 2.5 years. Her name was Nevis Fernandez. Before the war, she had been a school teacher and businesswoman in Tacloban. Quiet work, ordinary life, the kind of life that leaves no particular mark on history. Then Japan invaded the Philippines, and Nevis Fernandez decided, with the calm clarity of someone who has thought the matter all the way through, that she was not going to wait for someone else to do something about it. She was going to do it herself. Japan had moved against the Philippines in December 1941, launching attacks the same week as Pearl Harbor. The islands fell within months. What followed under Japanese occupation was one of the darkest chapters in the entire Pacific War. The death toll among Filipino civilians over the course of the occupation is estimated at over 500,000 people. Prisoners of war were subjected to torture that violated every standard of civilized conduct. Men were beaten, starved, and subjected to medical experiments performed without any form of anesthesia. Women were kidnapped from streets and villages and forced into military comfort stations, a word that covered a reality so brutal that survivors spent the rest of their lives struggling to describe it. For a school teacher who had spent her career protecting young people, watching the Japanese army move through her community and take what it wanted, her students, her neighbors, every shred of safety that ordinary life had once contained, something broke open inside her. She made her decision. She gathered a group of local men. She told them what she intended to do and asked who was willing to join her. 110 of them said yes. Together, they disappeared into the jungle south of Tacloban and began the work of building something the Japanese army would eventually come to fear in ways they had not anticipated. Resources were almost nothing. The Philippine resistance in 1942 was fragmented, undersupplied, and operating without reliable coordination or outside support. Neves and her group worked with what they could find and what they could make. They constructed crude shotguns from sections of gas pipe loaded with gunpowder and whatever metal they could salvage, rusted nails, scrap iron, anything with weight and edge. They built their own grenades. When operations succeeded and Japanese soldiers fell, the group quietly acquired the weapons those soldiers would no longer need. But Neves herself had developed something that did not require manufacture or supply chains. A technique. She fought barefoot so that her footsteps made no sound in the undergrowth. She wore dark clothing that dissolved into the jungle at night, and she had identified, through study or instinct or both, a precise point behind and below the human ear, a spot where a blade inserted correctly and quickly would sever the carotid artery and the internal jugular simultaneously. 2 inches of the bolo knife she carried, then a 90-degree twist. The result was immediate unconsciousness and death within seconds, with almost no sound produced by the victim. No gasp, no cry, nothing that would alert anyone nearby that anything had happened at all. The bolo knife was a farming tool, common across the Philippine countryside, used for clearing vegetation and working difficult terrain. Nobody glanced twice at someone carrying one. It was as ordinary as a garden implement. In her hands, it was something else entirely. For 2.5 years, Nevis Fernandez and her 110 fighters conducted operations against Japanese patrols and installations across the region around Tacloban. They moved under darkness. They struck and disappeared. They chose targets carefully and executed ambushes with a discipline that regularly confused Japanese commanders who were trying to understand what kind of force was operating against them out there in the dark. The Japanese army eventually arrived at an answer they had difficulty accepting. The fighter, terrorizing their patrols in the Leyte jungle, was a former school teacher in her late 30s. They placed a bounty on her head, 10,000 Philippine pesos, a considerable sum. People came looking. None of them found her. She was wounded once. A bullet scar remained on her right forearm. For the rest of her life, she kept fighting. Over those 2.5 years, her group killed over 200 Japanese soldiers. They liberated villages that had been living under direct military occupation. They freed women who had been taken or were about to be taken to comfort stations. They gathered intelligence and passed it toward American forces. and they survived, which in itself, against those odds, with those resources, was an achievement that military historians still find remarkable. When American forces landed on Leyte in October 1944 and pushed inland, they found Nevis Fernandez already there. She had preceded them. She walked up to American officers barefoot, in her plain dark dress, and demonstrated her knife technique on the spot when they asked to understand how it worked. The only published article written about her at the time quoted her directly. "When they called me captain, I was Nevis Fernandez. Now I am just Miss Fernandez." That was how she described herself. Just Miss Fernandez. She was 38 years old. She had spent 2.5 years in the Philippine jungle, organizing, training, supplying, and leading a guerrilla force against one of the most formidable military machines in the Pacific. She had developed a method of silent close-quarters combat that her enemies feared and her allies still study. She had protected her students, liberated her neighbors, and survived when survival itself seemed like too much to ask. History has a habit of remembering generals and politicians and the men who signed the documents. It is slower to remember the schoolteacher who walked barefoot into the jungle and refused to stop until it was over. But she was there. She fought. She won. And the 200 soldiers who never came back from those Leyte jungle patrols are the permanent record of what one ordinary woman decided to do when ordinary life was no longer an option. Thank you for watching. If Nevis Fernandez's story moved you, subscribe now, because there are more stories like this one that the world needs to remember.